All right, welcome to American Spirits Episode 2, uh, Episode 2, Part 2, redone, redux. Yes, we're redoing Episode 2 because we had some technical difficulties. So apologies for that last week, but now we're back to our default streaming setup where I won't be running the software. So everything should be running normally. Thanks everyone for tuning in as usual. And of course, I'm joined by my co host Ryan Turnipseed, as usual, along with Mr. Alberon Quinn beneath me on the screen. So, hello, gentlemen. Thank you for joining once again.
Thank you for having us.
Indeed, it is a pleasure, even though I am seething with rage at Elon for deleting 30% of our frames last week.
Yeah, that's probably what happened. It was probably a Starlink issue. But now, since I'm not streaming, we don't have to worry about it. We'll figure it out later. But, gentlemen, let's just jump right into the topic. So, I've got the old stream in front of me from last week, and what I'm going to do is just sort of skip through it and basically read off the same quotations that we had before, and hopefully we can basically redo the stream basically the same way we were planning on doing it last time. So, part one, we had stopped getting ready, stopped after discussing the Puritans and Cavaliers, and we had much more we wanted to say on the Quakers and the backcountry peoples. So let's talk about let's do a quick recap. So the four main groups we're talking about are Puritans, who migrated to the Massachusetts area from East Anglia, which is the east of England mostly. Obviously, there's caveats with all these. We have the Virginia Chesapeake Bay Virginia Cavaliers, who mostly migrated to the United States or America at the time to from southwest England. And then we have the Quakers, who migrated more from the northern parts of England, if I recall the map correctly, into the Pennsylvania area. And finally, we had the backcountry peoples, who were mostly a Northern English, Scotland, and Irish group of peoples who came in all along the Appalachian Mountain Range, running all the way north and south. So a much more wider, more widely dispersed, much more ethnically plural group of people. So without recap out of the way, let's get right into the Quakers. So where we left off with the Quakers is discussing their family ways. So I'll read out this quotation I have here from the book. It reads, quote, Quakers gave special emphasis to the ideal of love as the spiritual cement of the family. One first generation Pennsylvanian wrote to his children, there is so much beauty in beholding brothers and sisters living in love, endeavoring to help one another as occasion may require. Their family correspondence was commonly a testimony of love between parents and children, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives. So this differentiates the Quakers quite a bit from the Puritans, where this we'll get more into this later when we discuss how they treated their children. But their whole society was very much more built around providing a loving environment, a loving family way for their children to be raised in. Um, Ryan, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, because this is important. So we talked about in part one, you can't understand the Quaker or the Puritans, I should say, if you do not also understand their deep devotion to their specific form of Calvinism. Similarly, at the Quakers, you will not be able to understand their society if you do not understand that they tried to base everything around their interpretation of the Golden Rule as recorded in the Gospels. It's a very reciprocal society. Obviously, it's nonviolent because it's Quakerish, but it goes beyond that. It seeps into every facet of Quaker society. The interesting thing about this excerpt, I remember when I was reading this, is that this seems to be where we get what's now like the romanticist notion of love and marriage in the American culture, which is you need to be in love. In fact, there might be a different excerpt that we had last time on stream but didn't get to. I forget, but there's this loving family ideal, loving marriage ideal that you find with the Quakers. We now know that as sort of like an idealistic notion for marriage. but for Quakers, it wasn't an ideal. It wasn't romanticist. That was just that was what was expected. It was this a prerequisite for a family, for marriage, and for all these other things. So that was I believe that was the point that I made on the last attempt for this stream.
Indeed, and just to bounce back to the Puritans, because this was an interesting thing we didn't get to mention when we talked about them, was the Puritans had this this covenantal understanding of marriage, where love, in the romantic sense between the man and the wife, was also considered very important, to the extent that they practiced this practice called bundling, where they would actually get two young courting lovers, bundle the up up so that she literally couldn't open her legs, and then have them spend the night together so that they would get to know each other enough to love each other and enter into a covenantal marriage. The Quakers didn't practice this quite so physically, but the underlying ethos of the Quakers is less covenantal and more emotively based.
All right, and just to continue hammering this point home, if we could bring up the screenshot for page 484, I will just read, quote, Quakers repudiated the principle of fear as the cement of family relations. Puritans and Anglicans both regarded fear as a healthy emotion and urged that it should be cultivated in relations between parents and children, and even husbands and wives. Members of the Society of Friends, however, actively condemned fear as an organizing principle of human relationships, except fear of God. They built their ideas of the family upon a radically different base. And of course, we've of course already discussed what that base was. And again, this contrasts them with the other two main groups that we discussed that have some sort of strong particular religious basis, namely the Puritans, who not only feared God, but had a fear of the dark and a sort of searching fear for where the devil might be hiding within their society.
Yeah, and I don't really have much to add there. If we were good to go on to marriage.
Yeah, so if we could bring up, do you know the title of the screenshot?
It would be 485, excerpt 485 from my list on how the Quakers practice marriage.
Excellent. I'll go ahead and quote it. Yeah. Quote, but Quaker moralists demanded that love must be a part of every marriage. They believed that marriage should be a union of sweethearts, a word which they often used. Further, they insisted that love should precede marriage, and not merely following it. But this was to be the pure and undefiled love between Christians, not a carnal appetite for the flesh. Quakers also condemned dynastic marriages which were made for material gain. They forbade first cousin marriages, which were commonplace in Virginia. During the 18th century, many Quaker meetings even discouraged unions between second cousins, a major restriction in small rural communities. End quote.
Yeah.
Right.
And,
so, sorry, you first.
I was just going to say the America today is almost unique in its horror of consanguinity. Cousin marriage is, a slur we throw at each other, and it's interesting to see the genesis of this attitude here with the Quakers.
Right, and I also found this the use of sweethearts to be very interesting, because that's another thing that's been heavily integrated into the American understanding of marriage. And there was in my collection there was a 485 on marriage patterns, not just in terms of banning cousin marriage, but also in terms of banning marriage to outsiders. So if you we brought up earlier kind of how the Quakers had this idea of applying the golden rule to absolutely everybody. They were pacifistic. Many people might be wondering, how did they keep their society together? Why didn't they just dissolve? Seems like a very strange way to maintain a society. Well, and the answer is just because they strictly prohibited any Quaker marrying a non-Quaker. This was seen as absolutely verboten. So much so that this was what they called mongrel marriages. Was marriages to non-Quakers. It was a very strict custom and kept their society together, at least in terms of Quakerism.
and it would get you disowned if you married outside the religion. There were many records of families just completely cutting off all contact.
Right.
Yes, reading your screenshot here, it does mention that exactly that disciplinary proceedings would take place in the Quaker meetings, their town meetings, regarding people who engage in these mongrel marriages to outsiders. Again, this emphasizes this idea that we talked about last stream, but just to reemphasize it, the Quakers maintained a very tight oligarchy that retained control over their colony. And that oligarchy still exists up until this day, although their religious ways certainly aren't as strict as they once were. The descendants of those people still exist and are still, in large part, the elite of that area of the country. Let's see. Moving on, let's get to the gender ways, which relates to what we're talking about, obviously. So I'll quote something at length here. Quote, "These gender ways arose not only from the religious beliefs of the Quakers, but also from the regional culture of England's North Midlands. In the mother country, Quaker teachings on gender," I said teachings, "found their strongest following within an area which had a distinct ethnic character as a consequence of having been heavily settled from Scandinavia." Right, I recall what we were discussing here. So the reason I'm quoting this is to discuss how their gender ways had possibly originated in Scandinavian culture, because the area of England that they migrated from was more heavily colonized by the Scandinavian peoples, what you would call Vikings, and people can quibble over what a Viking really refers to. But continuing the quotation, quote, "In Scandinavian culture, women enjoyed positions of high social status with full legal rights. The burial mounds of females were on par with males of the same rank. The Norse sagas were full of strong-minded and independent women who were not culturally equal to men in all respects, but who expected to be treated with equality of esteem," end quote. So this is an important part of the Quaker culture, because they had this saying, I think it was, "In souls there is no sex." They also permitted women, and we'll get to even children, to preach, not necessarily in their formal church gatherings, but sort of in public, just in the open. They had no particular restrictions on whether or not women were allowed to express their own Quakerism in terms of their religious perspective to others, and they could act as spiritual leaders. Ryan, also, you have a quote here, actually, on this.
It's from 492. Just because, once again, it may sound like the Quakers are hyper modern comparatively, and in some respects they are. But our author Fisher reminds us that they aren't. We shouldn't try to take our modern categories, progressive, conservative, traditionalist, or whatever else, and put them on these groups, because they had a reason for believing what they did, and it doesn't 100% line up with what we experience today. So Mr. Fisher writes, "The Quakers themselves did not entirely escape these conventional prejudices," talking about differences between women and men. "Their idea of spiritual equality between the sexes had its limits. The early Friends were not modern feminists, and normally expected female preachers to show a measure of modesty and restraint." And then it goes into a primary source example. But the whole point of bringing this up on the stream is that legally and in writing, men and women were far more equal in the Quaker settlements than in the other ones. However, there was sort of a de facto or an expected inequality that they were supposed to maintain. Now that we're talking about this about 300 years after the fact, we can see that this might have been wrong-headed in multiple ways. We may have theological disagreements, but it is interesting to see that they didn't really view themselves as egalitarian. They, by all accounts, weren't exactly egalitarian. It's just that their beliefs led them to this arrangement, and they still expected some difference between men and women.
It does show a much more Platonic cast of mind, though. The statement that in sex or in souls there is no sex. That's a very, you know, Platonic statement of we have these spiritual beings to which our bodies are just appurtenances and not part of our essential identity that we would see metastasize in the years to come.
Yeah, the author himself, I believe, uses the word egalitarian somewhere in here. Um, One of the things we have to keep in mind about this book and our discussion of it is that by necessity, because of the way we understand culture, we're going to use words like libertarian, liberal, progressive, egalitarian, but these words are grasping at ways of society, of social organizing and being that no longer exist, and we could only sort of grasp at what these things truly meant by using modern language that we and our listeners will understand. But whenever these words are used, they shouldn't be used in a one-to-one fashion. I think the misuse of terms like this can probably explains at least some of the erroneous what you call the Puritan hypothesis that we discussed last time, and I think we will discuss a bit again today.
Yeah,
Right.
these are anachronisms, but being moderns, we have to use the categories which the modern mind is equipped with, and so do give due latitude in your analysis.
Right, and it's yeah. So we're speaking in analogies, basically. Have to keep that in mind, you the listener. Also, something that should be kept in mind is that the Puritans aren't the only one that have been sort of mispopularized or misinterpreted, because something that we talked about at great length in the first stream is that both the North and the South, the Puritans and the Cavaliers, have a few misattributions to them. This is also true of the two ones that we're covering a little bit more in depth today, the Quakers and the Backcountry. And in case I need to remind anyone, this is very important because these four groups of English peoples form the core of America. So if you really think that one of these groups is totally poisonous, that they're evil or something like that, you can't really hold that view and also hold any views relating to your heritage as an American being good, because it's all likelihood you've been influenced by all four of these groups in ways that you are either cognizant of or are yet to realize.
Absolutely.
As we shall see.
All right, now let's move on. Also related to family and gender ways is the child rearing ways, and it's Delaware child rearing ways bracing the will. Quote, on the subject of child rearing, Quaker ideas took form very slowly during the 17th century. The founder, George Fox, continued for many years to endorse the Calvinist idea that all children should be brought into and kept in subjection through the breaking of the stubborn will within. But many Quakers rejected that idea that children were born evil, and some also denied the doctrine of original sin. Robert Barclay condemned this cardinal belief of Calvinism as an unscriptural barbarism. By the early 18th century, Quakers in both England and America had come to believe that small children were harmless, righteous, and innocent creatures. Many members of the Society of Friends believed that children were incapable of sin until old enough to understand their acts. Others suggested that youngsters continued in a state of innocence until they were old as 11 or 12, end quote. So obviously that's a pretty far removed from what I think most Christians today, unless you happen to be a Quaker, understand about the nature of sin and when it comes into one's life. And of course, aside from the religious implications, this also emphasizes the degree to which their society was organized around children and the idea that the child is this sort of well, they believe that there's a bit of no, that's the Puritans, sorry, but the they believe the child was this creature that needed to be protected and guarded and loved, and the whole society was basically built around creating bringing that child into adulthood, preserving the Quaker ways, and then repeating that process over and over and over again as the generations passed.
This is the society the most out of the four that is pro children. And in fact, something they practice these ideals as well. On page 509, I don't know if it's entirely needed for me to read this out, but the gist is that since Quakers viewed children in such a positive light, they also had this very strong idea that people could reason out their differences. Once again, they were pacifists. They basically practiced libertarian parenting. They condemned striking children in order to teach them and shoo them away from bad things. It's exactly what I've heard from even many people in our spheres that eschew spanking children and whatnot. Where it's basically, if your rules are good, you should be able to explain them to the child, and the child should comprehend them. It's this has been around for a lot longer than I realized before reading the book. I thought that was a very new method of parenting, but the Quakers were, at least in doctrine, practicing it.
Indeed, Stephen Molyneux smiled. But you said in doctrine, but there are certainly accounts of individual Quaker parents who didn't live up to this standard and would beat their children when they just got so angry that their frustration overcame them. And what struck me as interesting is that the children in those cases would harbor lifelong resentments against their parents for that, which you wouldn't see, necessarily in a Puritan or a Cavalier family, but in the Quaker families where they had this underlying ethic that failure to live up to it seemed to be particularly poisonous.
Right, and this is I think this is very important because something that you'll be able to see when we cover the Quakers and then the Englishmen, the Scots-Irish, allegedly in the backcountry, is that you will be able to see. You can either see these two groups as diametrically opposed. The backcountry is very violent, has the sort of American libertarianism that we're familiar with, at least a nascent form. Once again, an analogy, not a perfect one-to-one. Quakers also have a sort of a strand of a nascent libertarianism. They also have a nascent progressivism. It's very easy to see how Quaker society, if one dropped Quaker beliefs, could eventually grow into either the American coastal elite, which has a very distinct culture around it, one that overemphasizes childhood and sort of dislikes parents that are mean and whatnot else, or it could turn into a sort of more secularized anarcho-capitalism, perhaps. You can sort of see, if you read this or if you see the quotes that we're showing you, you can see how these develop in such ways.
Indeed, and the resonances will only grow as we proceed.
And proceed we will. So you have a few things here, Ryan, about the sex ways of the Quakers, particularly some of their stricter laws against various forms of degeneracy. Page 492, I believe, one of them.
499, I think.
499. Well, at least whatever you had highlighted was the. We didn't actually cover this on our original stream, but you mentioned this quote here about how they were interested in ending the exploitation of their social inferiors, which I just thought I would be worth pointing out. But the particular thing I think you want to get to on page 499 is the concept of adultery. Is that right?
Yes. So this is if you're going to have a very religiously tolerant and open society, you're going to have some social mechanism to enforce it. Quakers don't believe in they're pacifists in terms of war and brawling and whatnot else, but they still believed in enforcing penalties of the law against things that were considered to be abominable. So the thing that this caption emphasizes is how they punished fornication. And I'll just read this here. This is Mr. Fisher writing. Quakers were especially interested in ending the sexual exploitation of social inferiors. That's what Charlie just mentioned. George Fox, in 1672, insisted that any master who had sexual relations with a female servant must marry her, no matter what the difference in outward rank or race. So this is already if you view sexual degeneracy as something to be stopped, many in our sphere, I hope, would find that to be a just cause. You can see the Quakers are already enforcing this just a little bit more than the Cavaliers are. Once again, both groups had their rationale for why their laws were the way they were. We covered this at length, talking about Virginia's fornication laws in the first stream. But the Quakers here are perhaps the most strict in this matter. So Fisher continues, the meetings of Friends also specifically condemned the predatory attitude towards sexuality, which had been so much a part of Virginia's sexual customs. And then if I skip just a little bit, the colony's law code of 1683 included a statute against fornication, which specified that both single men and women should be punished by enjoying marriage or fine or corporal punishment, or any or all of these. It was the most rigorous out of the colonies, and it was eventually abolished by the Crown in 1700 for being unreasonable. So the English, back in the mother country, thought the Quakers were way too radical in the colonies, especially compared to the other groups there. This is a lot of modern libertarian theorists, anarchists, will talk about how you need sort of a private institution to uphold a society, or else it will just degenerate. And the Quakers seem to have understood this, or they just reasoned themselves into a system that preserved this for a while, at least until it was abolished out from the outside.
Indeed. In fact, this emphasis on private enforcement was particularly strong with the Quakers, to the point that you could be sanctioned for going to the law courts instead of handling things through the church authorities.
That's right. This was mentioned earlier in terms of their disciplinary hearings regarding mongrel marriages. But yes, the Quakers frowned very much on bringing your fellow friend to court. Private arbitration, and I believe we're going to cover this later, private arbitration was very much preferred and really required in terms of settling disputes between fellow friends, most of which regarded their private rights.
Indeed, and regarding...
Sorry, continue. I was going to change
subject
subject ever so slightly. Well, I was going to say I've been able to do a little bit more outside research since now, and I'll save what I'm going to comment in specific until we read this quote that's currently on screen. But these were the colonists that were most favored by the American ANCAP movement. Not something that I'm sure I entirely believe, but it is fascinating that you see here this. If you were to show, say, an American progressive the four groups in these colonies, they probably find most affinity with the Quakers. The anarcho-capitalists did too, but the reasoning for both sides is the exact opposite. They take one half and try to leave the other half out.
All right, scrolling back through our original screen, I realized we missed a few things on the child ways. Now I think most of what we would respond to, with was already said earlier, but just to reinforce what we said and the Quaker perspective on children, I will quote here from page 508 on their child ways. Quote, these ideas about child nature created distinctive Quaker customs of child nurture, which differed very much from those of Puritans and Anglicans. The first and most important difference was in the special intensity of Quaker interest in the young. One Quaker parent wrote in her diary, my chief concern is about my children. Oh, if they may be preserved out of wickedness. There is so much wickedness in this place on every side. Others expressed the same interest in a happier way. Isaac Norris wrote of his own children, I have 2 daughters yet alive, delightful children. They are a constant care, as well as a great amusement and diversion to me, to direct their education aright and enjoy them truly in the virtuous improvements of their tender minds. This concern was shared not merely by parents, but the entire community. One historian concludes from a long acquaintance of meeting records that the Quaker yearly meetings for nearly 3 centuries have drawn attention to the welfare of young peoples more frequently than any other topic. And then quoting again from page 510, quote, child nurture among friends, however, should not be confused with a modern permissive system. Quaker children were trained to strict ideals of silence and subjection, not so much to parents or elders, but to the meeting. The individuality of the Quaker child was subordinated to the entire community, even as it was protected against the relentless will breaking of the Puritans and the hierarchical will bending of the Virginians. Child rearing was a communal process which collectively involved many people besides the parent themselves. In learning about goals for raising children, an historian of one Quaker family writes, the Pembertons largely relied upon the exchange of ideas among family and friends. In the main, parents expected to raise children in much the same way that they had been raised. End quote. So I don't know if either of you fellows want to add anything there. I think we cover the child rearing, but I did want to read those two additional quotes. And after that, we had a discussion of Quakers, the Quakers' honor culture, which I would like to get to next, unless you have anything to say.
That sounds good to me.
Cool. So we'll get to the backcountry peoples right after this, but first on the Quakers, and in terms of what you would call their honor culture, quote, a Quaker's honor was far removed from the code of chivalry that existed among Virginia gentlemen. It was also not the same as the contractual code that was kept by New England's specially elected saints. Instead, it was a reputation for Christian love, peace, good neighborhood, godliness, and doing good to others. As such, it became profoundly important to their comity. Joseph Oxley instructed his children, there is much beauty in beholding brethren and sisters living in love, endeavoring to help one another, and as occasion may require. In doing so, my children, your peace will flow in upon you abundantly, and your reputation and honor will be renowned among men. The Lord will delight himself in you. In this culture, as in every other of the same era, reputation and honor were urgently important. When a Quaker lost honor, he was compelled to stand before his brethren and to take shame upon himself, or be expelled from their association. The social operation of honor, reputation, and shame was similar in some respects among Quakers, Puritans, and Anglicans in the 17th and early 18th century, but the substance of these social ideas differed very much from one group to another.
Indeed, and here you can see prefigured both the virtue signal and the struggle session. This Quaker idea of reputation for doing good stands in stark contrast to what you see with the Cavaliers or the backcountry people, where you or the Puritans, but you can fundamentally divide these two concepts of the four concepts of honor into two larger categories: honor based on what you do, and honor based on who you are. The Quakers and the backcountry peoples both are notable for having honor cultures that are rooted in what they do, whereas the Puritans and the Cavaliers have honor cultures rooted in what they are. In the case of the Puritans, in being elect; in the case of the Cavaliers, in their fortune and the way they were born into society. And then if we subdivide them further, when you look at the Quakers, it's what you do for your fellow man and what you're seen to have done for your fellow man. Whereas with the backcountry people, when we get there, we'll see it's rather more aggressive. But yeah.
The only thing that I would mention here is just to reemphasize that once again, due to the Quakers' beliefs, if they didn't have this sort of strict social enforcement of their values, just because they're pacifistic, the whole project probably would have dissolved. So if you want to know, once again, how did this society persist for so long, if at least if your conception of them is that they were very permissive, they had ways that look very modern of maintaining their society, which I personally find fascinating that this was being practiced in the 17th century into the 18th century. So that's a long time ago for them to have basically configured this very strange society. Not in a bad way. It is just very alien to me.
Yes. Well, let's move on to the backcountry peoples now. And
there were a few things that we mentioned on the first attempt at this stream that I don't think we got to. One of which I think is very important for later on, because Midwestern culture has this stereotype that it's mostly derived from German immigration, And to be fair, the Pennsylvania colony had a lot of early German immigration, but I believe Mr. Quinn on the last time we did this pointed out that he saw some Midwestern cultural habits in the Quakers themselves that might have pointed to the culture being a little bit more English than previously conceived.
Indeed, thank you for reminding me, Ryan. I was struck as I read the Quaker section of the book by visions of Wisconsin and pre-Somalian Minnesota. It's a very in the Midwest we have a term for this phenomenon. It's called Midwestern nice, where your Moors emphasize heavily being nice to people, being superficially, very affable and friendly to everyone you meet. And I had always figured that was a product of the heavy German and Scandinavian settlement of that area of the country, and just assumed that those folkways came from there. But reading about the Quakers, I see that there was another older font of that particular attitude.
Right, and if I may, very quickly before we move on as well, because I think we're moving just ever so slightly faster than we did last time. Just a brief note on the
time, so feel free.
So bonus content, the Quaker economy, which may sound boring. It's very, very quick though, and I think it's very, very useful to know for how Quaker society functioned. I don't think we need the excerpt on screen. I can just fly through this very quickly. The Quakers were by far the most commercial, or at least this specific section of the English colonies was the most commercial, with the Puritans coming in a close second and perhaps overtaking them by the end of the colonial period. But for the vast majority, it was the Quakers that would have been considered the commerce hub. This is important because it does two different things. If you hold to the view that the Puritans are where we get the focus on manufacturing, there is a lot of that there. But don't forget about the Quakers. The Quakers had a very commerce-heavy influence on America. They owned a lot of banks. They were very active in London. And the second important thing is that this focus on commerce, or at least the way they pursued it, it's not necessarily the case, I don't think, but just my opinion. This is ultimately what will lead to them, among a couple of other factors, becoming a minority, this sort of Anglo-Welsh Quaker aristocracy getting crowded over by more and more different European peoples. They imported some of them, like we'll get to the backcountry here in a second, but also just their focus on commerce led to a great deal of people coming into this sort of middle colony area. And also they tried to set up like a welfare system basically out of charity. And they encountered probably a very familiar problem to anyone living in urban America, which is that the system just it basically formed a semi-permanent underclass. You couldn't not donate because that was socially unacceptable, as we've been discussing. They were the first virtue signalers, or at least you can see a nascent sentiment there. But also, a few of them even recognized that this system of welfare, or early welfare and charity, made an underclass, and that was not the intention when the colony was first founded.
Indeed, we saw the same thing with Virginia, where the Anglican Church would spend something like 3/4 of its revenue paying for the upkeep of the underclass that developed there from the indentured servants and slaves that had been brought in to that colony to serve as its workforce.
Right, and that's something to keep in mind, perhaps, because it might be far removed compared to current American society, but only really one of these sections of the country was founded with the intention of having an underclass, and that would have been the Virginia colony. Mm-hmm. They were somewhat explicit in it, but the other three, the Puritans most extremely, but the backcountry and the Quakers to a almost equal extent, did not like the idea of an underclass. They viewed the New World as an opportunity to have a society which did not need to rely on like a poorer, more violent underclass that has to live in squalor. They viewed this idea as this arrangement as something to flee and create something new here. So this is perhaps one of the first widespread examples or systematic examples in the New World of a very strong unintended or contradictory consequence.
Indeed, it's instructive because the Puritans largely avoided creating an underclass. I mean, there's always poor people, but the Puritans were remarkable for how evenly spread the prosperity of the Commonwealth was amongst its constituent members, whereas the Quakers seemed, with the best intentions in the world, to have blundered into recreating the class system.
All right. Well, with that, if you guys are ready, we can get on to the backcountry peoples and begin by discussing their family ways. So the author points out regarding the backcountry people. I'm not sure which page this is, but quote, beyond the Derbfine lay a larger ring of kinship, which was called the clan in North Britain. We think of clans today mainly in connection with the Scottish Highlands, but they also existed in the Lowlands, Northern Ireland, and England's border countries, where they were a highly effective adaptation to a world of violence and chronic insecurity. The clans of the border were not precisely the same as those of the Scottish Highlands, and very different from the Victorian contrivances of our own time. They had no formal councils, tartans, sporrans, bonnets, or septs, but they were clannish in the most fundamental sense, a group of related families who lived near to one another, were conscious of a common identity, carried the same surname, claimed descent from common ancestors, and banded together when danger threatened. End quote. So the culture of the backcountry peoples is very much oriented around their family and their family surname, and I don't have the screenshot in front of me, but the author mentions this concept, for example, of the family feud, some of which may continue to this day. If you are an Appalachian, you may even know of some long-standing family feuds that still exist. So this is the central organizing unit around which the backcountry peoples built their society. And
right, sorry, I just returned here.
Yeah.
So just to make it even more clear, if you couldn't understand the Puritans, except for understanding their covenantal theology, their very peculiar form, the Quakers, the Golden Rule, the Virginians, their emphasis on lineage in particular, you cannot understand the backcountry without understanding the clan system of family organization. So very important. You can interpret everything they do, basically, except for just a few things through organizing the family in such a way. This is their main feature.
Indeed, and it's interesting to note that it's not quite as patriarchal as you might imagine it is.
Yeah,
right, and
do we want to move on to that?
That was what I was
sorry.
signaling, yes.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, which topic?
The mountain grandmother?
Yeah, I remember last stream.
Mountain grandmother,
you...
yes. Unfortunately, I don't have the quote in front of me, and I don't have the book on me either. But I relayed the story of a. Yes,
I'll find it.
Yeah, jump to.
Sorry, I didn't mean to trigger a discussion we weren't prepared for.
No. If you two will keep discussing, I'll find the quote because it's funny.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's somewhere just after like page 600, 620, something like that. So, yes, I will discuss that though. So the backcountry had a particular archetype called the mountain grandmother, which is this particularly elderly woman who commands an inordinate amount of respect in regard to her physical stature. Now, of course, you did have backcountry grandfathers who commanded a different type of respect, but the backcountry grandmother was this figure who was sort of could exert a power beyond physical influence and was basically immune to any sort of physical attack against her. I don't know if you found the quote at this point, Ryan.
Not just yet.
Okay.
We can. I'll keep finding it, and we can come back to it because I think it's germane for the audience to hear it. It's hilarious.
Yes. Well, while you look for that little story about the elder, it's probably in the age ways section. I will relay some information about the child ways, particularly their will enhancing ways. I don't have the quote in front of me, so you might want to pull that up too if you care to. But I can summarize effectively the way the backcountry peoples raised their children was, as opposed to the sort of will bracing that we just discussed with the Quakers or the will bending of the Virginians, uh, or the will breaking of the Puritans, the backcountry peoples actually had what the author described as a positively will enhancing child rearing, which took the children and turned them into highly autonomous individuals, especially the male children who would defend, their honor without a moment's hesitation, which could even result in some. There was a story the author had relayed about basically a gang of children attacking their own mother and potentially even threatening her life. So the autonomy and the willpower of the backcountry children, particularly the males, completely outshined anything that the other three cultures produced in terms of the sheer willpower. And of course, we have many famous individuals who have come out of these backcountry places, such as Andrew Jackson, John C. Calhoun, Patrick Henry. There's an anecdote we will mention later in regards to him.
Probably the purest. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ryan.
No. You go.
Probably the purest artistic expression of this idea of enhancing the will is the Johnny Cash song "A Boy Named Sue," which tells the story of a son who finds his father, who has named him Sue for the express purpose of inflicting a lifetime of adversity on him to toughen him up.
Yes, and this is so a lot of the stuff we're going to be discussing about the backcountry here is going to be very reminiscent of American Western culture, the frontier, pioneers, and any conception you have of settling the West. There's going to be a lot of backcountry involved there, just by virtue that they were the population that got to brave the harsh wilderness, as opposed to the other three groups we've discussed so far. But now that we've talked about the autonomy and independence of the children, I think we can buttress that with the hilarious mountain grandmother story, if you guys are ready.
Ready.
Alrighty. So this is Fisher writing right now. He says, "The authority of these mountain grandmothers was very great, and their wrath was terrible to behold. Emma Miles observed a scene between one of these old women and a backcountry preacher named Elisha Robbins, who preached that even his own mother would be eternally damned without baptism in his own small sect. This doctrine brought upon him the full wrath of a mountain granny." And this is Emma Miles' account now. "Lishy," she shrilled at him, unheeding the crowd. "Lishy Robbins, I held you in my arms before you were 3 hours old, and you ought to be slapped over for preaching any such foolishness about your mother, and I'm a-gwine to do it." And forthwith she did. Her toil-hardened old fist shot out so unexpectedly that the young preacher went down like a cornstalk. Angry? Of course he was angry, but she was a grandmother of the mountains. There was nothing for it but to pick himself up with as much dignity as remained to him. Yeah, so this is you find this a lot in more clan organized cultures. It's you can have a very patriarchal elements, but if the oldest of the whole family happens to be a grandmother, they get a lot of the same power in a lot of similar forms.
All right, yeah, thank you for finding that. And following along where we had originally gone in the stream, it looks like we moved on to the power ways of the Quakers and the backcountry peoples. Did you have anything you wanted to mention?
Yeah. There was a really important part of the backcountry family, and for the purpose of the stream, this is 689 on the beatings of children, which is a very recognizable part of the backcountry. It's basically the total opposite of the Quakers. And this will explain it the most. Fisher writes, "Corporal punishment of children was condemned in the abstract, but much practiced in an intermittent way. A backcountry church in Lunenburg County, Virginia, considered the question, quote, is it lawful to beat or whip servants or children before the method that Christ laid down in the 18th Matthew, and decided the issue in the negative by majority vote. Another doctrine of St. Matthew is explicitly ratified by this congregation, and it reads, take heed that ye despise not one of these little ones. But backcountry autobiographers also remembered terrific beatings received from frustrated fathers and mothers who found themselves equally incapable of controlling their children or restraining their own parental rage. These autobiographers also recalled their feelings of anger against what seemed to be parental tyranny. The result was a highly volatile process of child rearing, extremely permissive most of the time, but punctuated by acts of angry and illegitimate violence. So this is interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, I didn't even know that the backcountry and the folkways that followed from it even condemned child beatings in the abstract. So that was a sort of fascinating thing to find in the book. Number two, if your original conception of Quaker society was that they were very permissive, in action it seems the backcountry was more permissive. It was just punctuated by a very extreme correction, kind of like we mentioned with the Quakers earlier. It's just they didn't endorse it, but then again, neither did the backcountry. So this is all fascinating to me. The other thing to keep in mind as well that we didn't explicitly mention this time, I don't think we even did last time. We just talked about it. Was that I believe it was Henry Muhlenberg, the first Speaker of the House. He was in Pennsylvania. He remarked that there was a form of Quaker parental tyranny over their children because they expected their children to be with them basically at all times, past growth. So this is something that's sort of an interesting parallel. The backcountry had a form of tyrannical parenting in the form of violence. The Quakers had a form of tyrannical parenting in the form of just keeping them in the house way past when they should have been, at least as they conceived it. But the Quakers did have this trad multi-generational household, which has its own drawbacks and traditions along with it.
All right, very good. That was a good contribution. And yeah, we are a little ahead. I'm kind of going a little faster on purpose just because I'm cognizant of the fact that we did leave some things out last time due to times. So if you want to add in a few new things, definitely feel free.
If we were going to move on to the power ways, I forget, did we mention... What was that?
Did we mention what?
Did we mention religion before the power ways?
We can if you want. It's funny because I was going to say that last time Mr. Quinn asked that we move to the discussion of political parties and Quakers, and I said that I was fine with, jumping around. So if you want to repeat that pattern and jump to their religious ways.
Yeah, just because it kind of goes along with the mountain grandmother anecdote just a little bit. If you're wondering what is this small sect doing in the backcountry. And this is page 703. Yeah, sorry to jump around. I just figured it would mesh quite nicely with what we've just discussed. The backcountry was the most militant low church society by far. The Quakers have their own form of being low church. They were very bare, autonomous. We'll get to that in a moment. Sorry, I forgot the pacing of the stream. But while we're on the subject of backcountry culture, it was militantly low church, and just this first paragraph here I think is enough to or this first two paragraphs is enough to get that idea into the audience's mind. So basically we have an Anglican missionary, Charles Wood Mason, was going to evangelize the backcountry, and Fisher says his self-appointed task was a heavy one, for Wood Mason's idea of the heathen was as spacious as the land itself, which included Indians, Africans, Presbyterians, Congregationalists or Puritans, Quakers, Baptists, Irish of any denomination, and even Anglicans of low church opinions. Traveling into the interior of Carolina, Wood Mason met a reception which was very mixed, to say the least. Some settlers welcomed him into their cabins, others drove him away by force. One family of Scottish Presbyterians told him plainly that they wanted no damned black-gowned sons of bitches among them, and threatened to use him as a backlog in their fireplace. Others stole his horse, rifled his clothing, drank his rum, and even purloined his prayer books. So this is you can see this in American society, most certainly in just broad evangelicalism, militantly independent, low church. They will not submit to a clerical authority, whether that be good or bad. We don't have to comment on this stream, but this is starkly important for their culture.
Yeah, no,
that was all I
that was
had.
a very good addition. I'm glad we had time to actually read that out this time. um, okay, yeah. So my plan at this point is just to move on to discussing their political ways, their power ways on page 590, 591. I think we have a screenshot from you on that, and the the gist of it is that basically Quakers more or less invented the first political parties in America. I will go ahead and read this quotation out since you just did a lot of reading. It is one of yours though. So page 590. Quote, so deep did these disagreements become in Pennsylvania that to James Logan it seemed as if the powers had break loose from their center, and the vessel of sovereignty had shattered into its separate shards of individual conscience. Quakers insisted that a believing Christian had a sacred duty to stand against evil in government, and that the individual's conscience was an arbiter of God's truth. The ideology of Quakerism justified political opposition in a way that was not the case in other English cultures. The political culture of Pennsylvania was defined not only by Quaker principles themselves, but also by a prolonged quarrel over their purposeful application. I'll just pause there. So, the context here is intense political disagreement, not even political disagreement, intense disagreement among the Quakers. And this ties into their liberty ways, which we'll get into in a second. But there's intense disagreement in terms of how how the government should interface with Quaker beliefs, and through these disagreements emerged political parties. And I'll continue the quote. One consequence was the emergence of political parties in Pennsylvania at an early date. By 1701, two stable parties were functioning in that province. Both consisted mainly of Quakers. The Country Party found its following mainly among farmers and artisans in the counties. The Proprietary Party was closely linked to the Penn family and was led by their agent James Logan in alliance with leading Quaker merchants in the city of Philadelphia. These parties nominated candidates, contested elections, issued manifestos, recruited stable followings, and defended positions of high principle. The major issues that divided them would be the classical constitutional questions of American politics, the powers of the proprietor and the assembly, the relative importance of property rights and personal liberties, the control of the judiciary. Both parties claimed to be defending their liberties in a classical conflict between two Whig ideologies. End quote.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Quakers infused their politics with a religious fervor, and it's very easy to see that in our present day that is kind of flipped, and we now infuse our religion with a political fervor. The religious is the political, and we see this also in the Quakers' food ways. They had this idea of not eating morally tainted food, not because of some physical property of the food, but because of the political implications of its provenance. So, for instance, they would not eat sugar because it was raised by slaves. They would not eat salt because salt was taxed in a way which the Quakers found illegitimate. So, they very much were willing to put their beliefs into practice in their personal lives and their food lives to such an extent that as they desacralized, this impulse kind of got inverted.
Right, and this is something else that's worth mentioning here is that one of the causes of the Quakers forming the first political parties is that compared to the other three groups right now, the Quakers were sophisticated enough, but also due to their religious precepts, tolerated these sorts of disagreements in such a way that was impossible in New England. It was anarchic in Virginia to propose such a thing, and the backcountry had no need of political parties due to how large the land area was.
Yeah,
But we'll get to their political theories eventually.
no, it's a very good insight, though, because of course, if you disagreed to this extent in Providence or Massachusetts, you would just be exiled. Whereas so the Quakers allowed them to coexist and instead developed a political life around the differences rather than just excising them.
Yes, they
Right,
would
and
excise you for other reasons, as we learned, but not for disagreement on matters of conscience. And before you make your point, Ryan, I just want to bring up the
yeah.
screenshot for page 597. Go ahead.
So this is also something to keep in mind, is that the Quakers weren't specifically trying to recreate society from the ground up that they themselves came up with. And it's also, to temper that statement, they also weren't here due to persecution, even though that was a factor. They viewed this as a new opportunity to put their beliefs into practice, but the Quakers viewed themselves as being very ancient. And before we get to what the book cites for that, something the book leaves out and that a lot of people leave out is that as we get into what Quaker politics looked like, it's going to look a lot like the Levelers from the English Civil War. Now, many things have been said about the factions of the English Civil War. The Levelers sometimes get confused for the Diggers being much more radical, subversive perhaps. The Levelers, however, look a lot like American political philosophy as captured by, say, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and then they even go slightly farther, but in the same political vein in other cases. And this would make sense. The leader of the Levelers, John Lilburne in England, converted to being a Quaker later in life. If you haven't read their Third Agreement of the People, it's a very short manifesto. You can read it and be shocked like I was at how close it was to, say, the American Bill of Rights or our constitutional tradition. The Quakers embody a lot of that. They weren't necessarily all Levelers, but they did have a lot of agreement with the Levelers, and some of them definitely were Levelers. So this is something to keep in mind. This is imported straight from England, and as we'll get into here in a second, they viewed themselves as carrying on ancient English traditions through this line of thought.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll go ahead and read what I'm about to read will give some idea as to what sort of things they'd be debating in politics. And shoot, where did my screenshot go? Okay. Nope, I lost it again. Okay, there it is. Quote, page 597. This Christian idea was reinforced in Quaker thinking by an exceptionally strong sense of English liberties. As early as 1687, William Penn ordered the full text of the Magna Carta to be reprinted in Philadelphia, together with a broad selection of other constitutional documents. His purpose was to remind the freeholders of Pennsylvania to remember their British birthright. He urged them not to give anything of liberty that at present they do enjoy, but take up the good example of our ancestors and understand that it is easy to part with or give away great privileges, but hard to be gained if lost. On the subject of liberty, the people of Pennsylvania needed no lessons from their Lord Proprietor. Few public questions were introduced among the colonists without being discussed in terms of rights and liberties. On its surface, this libertarian rhetoric seemed superficially similar to that of Massachusetts and Virginia, but the founders of Pennsylvania were a different group of Englishmen, a later generation from another English region, with a special kind of Christian faith. Their idea of liberty was not the same as that which came to other parts of British America. The most important of these differences had to do with religious freedom, liberty of conscience, William Penn called it. This was not the conventional Protestant idea of liberty to only do that which is right. The Quakers believed that liberty of conscience extended even to ideas that they believed to be wrong. Their idea of soul freedom protected every Christian conscience. The most articulate spokesman for this idea was William Penn himself. Of nearly 60 books and pamphlets that Penn wrote before coming to America, half were defenses of liberty of conscience. Some of these works were among the most powerful statements ever written on this subject. One ended with a revealing personal remark. "'Tis a matter of great satisfaction to the author that he has so plainly cleared his conscience in pleading for the liberty of other men's." End quote.
Right. So just to carry on the point I was making, and I'll be brief because this is secondary, but I also think it's really important because, as I said, there's a political movement in England in the middle of the 17th century that reads like our documents, which were drafted at the end of the 18th. So liberty of conscience comes up a lot. That didn't make it directly into our political tradition. It hasn't really survived as much, but the idea is there. It's this idea that the role of government is not specifically to bind people against their beliefs. This can be taken multiple different ways, but something that's very interesting about the Quakers and the Levelers as well is that this specifically applied to Christians. So this was not omni-tolerant. This was not for everyone. The Quakers and the Levelers envisioned a sort of pan-Christian society that would be peaceful, protect their liberties, and would be broadly tolerant from the most radical of Calvinists all the way to Roman Catholicism. The other thing that's quite interesting is that the Quaker colony put into practice a lot of Leveler principles, one of which was the idea that taxes should be on a short expiration date, with the idea being that people shouldn't be bound to basically ancient taxes decided by people who had different times. They were for different purposes. And this was a Leveler principle that made it to the Quaker colonies. Unfortunately, it didn't make it to the United States. I imagine if it did, and we actually believed in such a thing, we would be living in a perhaps a better society. But that's my own personal remarks coming out.
Yeah, and the Quakers really did walk the walk with liberty of conscience to the extent that they would even have some tolerance for popery. When Maryland, which had been founded as a Catholic colony, then got swamped by Protestant immigrants who voted to expel the Catholics, most of the Maryland Catholics ended up in Pennsylvania.
Right, and that's
a familiar problem.
It's that one's especially interesting because that the collapse of Maryland in that regard was caused by demographic shifts. Might be relevant today, but I think something especially relevant to us is they were actually able to keep a society that was broadly tolerant of Christianity, and there wasn't mass violence, there wasn't religious wars, there were no like religious wars of Pennsylvania or anything like this.
No, it is clearly to the Quakers that the First Amendment and its protections of Christian and religious pluralism owe the most. I don't see the First Amendment existing in a counterfactual America where the Quakers never came here.
Right, and this is since one of the things we've been emphasizing through this book, hopefully the audience has picked up on it, is that the fixation and the clinging to this concept of liberty is not a modern thing. It's not secular either. It's an ancient English tradition that the Americans inherited through the English peoples that settled on the East Coast and spread westward. I think perhaps we could get a lot of strategic value out of adapting some of this. For instance, there's a lot of religious spats online when I don't think there needs to be. Maybe we could take a hint from the Quakers, which their culture has and political theory has definitely influenced our heritage. Perhaps we could take a page from them and get along a little bit better.
Hear, hear.
All right. Well, now that we've covered some of the liberty, order, power ways for the Quakers, let's do the same for the backcountry. And we will bring up page 765, 766. And this discusses this concept of lex talionis, among other things. So I will quote from the book again, page 765. The backcountry order ways, the border idea of order as lex talionis. Within this comedy, personal relations between back settlers were often brutally direct. The mother of President Jackson prepared her son for this world with some strong advice. Andrew, she said, never tell a lie, nor take what is not your own, nor sue anybody for slander, assault, and battery. Always settle them cases yourself. That folk saying was a classical expression of backcountry attitudes toward order, which differed very much from other regions of British America. In the absence of any strong sense of order as unity, hierarchy, or social peace, back settlers shared an idea of order as a system of retributive justice. The prevailing principle was lex talionis, the rule of retaliation. It held that a good man must seek to do right in the world, but when wrong was done to him, he must punish the wrongdoer himself by an act of retribution that restored order and justice in the world. This backcountry idea of order rested upon an exceptionally strong sense of self-sovereignty. Wow, that is a That is a tongue twister. An exceptionally strong sense of self sovereignty. Something of the same principle had also existed in this Tidewater, Virginia, where the gentry were fond of quoting the old English cliche that every man's home was his castle. But the people of the back country went a step further. A North Carolina proverb declared that every man should be sheriff in his own hearth. That folk saying had been brought to the back country from the borderlands of North Britain, where it existed in almost the same words. Every man is a sheriff on his own hearth. This idea implied not only individual autonomy but autarky. Further, it narrowly circumscribed the role of government, for if every man were sheriff in his own hearth, then there was not very much work for a county sheriff to do except patrol the roads that lay in between. End quote.
Indeed, and when we talk about retributive justice, we're not talking just about an eye for an eye. The principle was actually 2 eyes for an eye. You would visit back more terrible retribution than had been inflicted upon yourself if you could.
Right, and this ethical principle specifically, you were supposed to hit back twice as hard. The only reason I bring this up is because it's a very endemic to American thought, and perhaps some people harass other groups within our spheres for being too modern. This sort of ancient idea, punch twice as hard if you get punched, does make it into libertarian ethics specifically. Like on the book, it talks about how correct retribution is twice as much for what was taken. So this is another thing I find interesting. A lot of the American focuses on liberty, whether the people writing about them realize it or not, are actually very ancient.
And also the degree of personal sovereignty you see here is remarkable. It's not merely your right to retribute a wrong to you. It is your duty to restore God's justice in the world personally when you have been the victim of an injustice.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's not merely taking revenge for a personal reason. There is a religious aspect to the restoration of order in the world. Speaking of which, on their order ways, on the next page, actually 767, I have another short quotation, which reads, quote, Lynch's Law, which probably took its name from Captain William Lynch of Pittsylvania County, Virginia, and later Pendleton District, South Carolina. Captain Lynch was a backcountry settler of border descent. Lynch's Law began as a formal agreement among his neighbors. Whereas many of the inhabitants of Pittsylvania have sustained great and intolerable losses by a set of lawless men, we will inflict such corporal punishment on him or them as to us shall seem adequate to the crime committed or the damage sustained. Lynch's Law was swift and violent. Its victims were often flogged and sometimes killed without much attention to due process or even to the evidence. One backcountry gravestone read, George Johnson hanged by mistake. End quote. So I'm not sure if the book points this out directly, but I believe this is where the concept of lynching comes from, which is this idea of private justice being done to the wrongdoers in a community as a sort of formal agreement among that community, which is a pretty libertarian idea, really.
Mm-hmm.
There's also they go by many different names. This sort of spontaneous order of law enforcement. So you get regulators in the 1700s, vigilantes in the 1800s, and then you get night riders in the 1900s. So this is something that's persisted quite a while. It also the fact that this is sort of just how border and Highlander, Lowlander, and Scots-Irish society functioned. This sort of almost anarchic society where order was just maintained by natural responses, violence met with twice the amount of violence, and justice administered privately. This is something that goes back quite a long ways. So I don't mean to keep making this too explicit, but I definitely will keep doing it. If anyone in the audience still has this idea that liberty, self-government, and sort of a private administering of justice, which is so characterized within American ideologies and beliefs, if anyone has the idea that these things are modern, new, aberrant, or whatever else, they just need to understand English society more and how it was imported here.
Yeah, this particular folkway, I mean, basically goes back as far as Hadrian's Wall. It's a very ancient way being in the world.
I might say before we move on, just very quickly, I think something that's worth noting, the thing that separates this honor culture from a lot of other ones is the fact that it was your duty to restore justice, but also if you couldn't do it, you were not obliged to. So there was this element of choice, this sort of pragmatic or strategic administering of justice. You were not expected to go and pointlessly die if you could not exact justice for whatever wrong was committed against your clan. I think this is probably what allows the backcountry in America to develop to the point that it did, to where it had a developed political philosophy, produced a lot of the greatest statesmen in United States history. It was an honor culture, but it was tempered to pragmatism.
Yes, I'm not sure if the quote is coming up, but I recall I talked about this last stream, how this concept of violence and employing violence, you were not expected to do so if there wasn't the chance of it succeeding. So it was completely fine to run away from a fight if you believed you would lose the fight. It was better to preserve yourself to fight another day rather than just sort of pointlessly throw yourself away for the sake of some more ephemeral concept of honor. The honor really stemmed from actually the winning a fight. It is the winning that counts in the backcountry, not the act of fighting some pointless battle just for the sake of it. Which,
yeah, we're not speaking of Bushido here. This is a very practical and pragmatic and strategic way of doing it.
So continuing along on these lines of thought, page 777, I will read on the backcountry freedom ways, the border idea of natural liberty. Quote, the back settlers, no less than other colonists in every part of British America, brought with them a special way of thinking about power and freedom, and a strong attachment to their liberties. As early as the middle decades of the 18th century, their political documents contained many references to liberty as their British birthright. In 1768, the people of Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, declared, we shall ever be more ready to support the government under which we find the most liberty. No matter whether they came from England or Scotland or Ireland, their libertarian ideas were very much alike, and profoundly different from notions of liberty that had been carried to Massachusetts, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. The traveler Johann Schopf was much interested in ideas of law and liberty, which he found in the back country. They shun which appears to demand of them law and order, and anything that preaches constraint, Schopf wrote of the back settlers. They hate the name of a justice, and yet they are not transgressors. Their object is merely wild, although altogether natural freedom is what pleases them. This idea of natural freedom was widespread throughout the southern back settlements, but it was not a reflexive response to the frontier environment, nor was it merely wild, as Schopf believed. The backcountry idea of natural liberty was created by a complex interaction between the American environment and a European folk culture. It derived in large part from the British border country, where anarchic violence had long been a condition of life. The natural liberty of the borderers was an idea at once more radically libertarian, more strenuously hostile to ordering institutions than were the other cultures of British America. End quote. So I think some of that last bit there sort of reinforces what Ryan was just saying about the sort of, and also Auberon, about the ancient roots of these perspectives on power, order, and liberty.
Yes, indeed, and I don't want to insinuate anything punitive here, but within the bounded rationality of the natural justice ideas that they had, it's easy to see how the natural freedom ideas organically arose.
Right, and this is so if you saw like Private Society of the Quakers, this more very modern American libertarian idea is probably where most people have heard it from. This border or backcountry idea of natural liberty is really what characterizes a lot of the philosophy, especially the more radical philosophy behind the American Revolution, and a lot of our first few generations of statesmen. John C. Calhoun, the famous supporter of nullification, leaned towards a much more decentralized federation, came from this society, And this is also back in England, the same society that produced Smithian economics and its idea of laissez-faire, very light regulation, free trade, and whatnot else. It's no coincidence that this same society keeps producing a lot of the more relaxed politicians, at least as it concerns government regulation. This is they grew up in and had only ever known for many generations a society which regulated itself through violence.
And very briefly, I'll just read another bit from page 773, which references actually the process of traveling to America and political improvisation that happened on ship. Quote, many American historians have observed the same process of political improvisation at work on the frontiers of settlement. Some attribute it to the frontier itself, but as Pierce Butler and British companions demonstrated, the process was fully at work before they reached the American shore. Their spontaneous shipboard polity rose not from the American environment, but from their British culture, and it became an important ingredient of backcountry politics. So that point there, whatever ship Pierce Butler was on, whatever disagreements they had in particular, I don't recall the example from the book, but the point is that this concept of political improvisation as the key word of how they politically organized themselves was already in full swing before they even came to the American environment. So the idea of the American frontier itself is what led to this culture is false. This culture mixed with the American frontier in its own unique ways, but that is not the actual source of this way of politics, essentially.
Right, and the quote on the screen kind of emphasizes this, because if you're going to do improvisational politics, it's going to be very personal. You're just going to have to get the people that you need to complete your agenda involved, and that's really as far as it goes. So this is the culture that gave us the sort of like the spoil system, patronage networks, and whatnot else, where it was very nepotistic, cronyist, however you want to describe it. Probably not necessarily in a bad term. It's just the way that they did politics was that it was by people, loyalty to people, addressing people. There was no, well, I shouldn't say there was no major abstract ideals. We just got them discussing natural liberty. But in terms of the actual political machine itself, it was very personal, very specific. This is sort of an extension of that improvisational politics.
Indeed, and it's a lesson we would do well to take to heart today.
I want to pull up page 778 next, but before I actually read that, I found the little proverb about violence and winning. The author actually writes, it is interesting that the proverbs of the backcountry justified the use of violence only when it promised to succeed. The backsettlers said, better a coward than a corpse, better a living dog than a dead lion. He that fights and runs away will live to fight another day. So there you go. Violence was very much present in the northern parts of the British Isles and Ireland, but also it was employed for the purposes of winning, not for abstract concepts of honor. So anyway, page 778, continuing on their liberty ways. This one's particularly interesting. It involves Patrick Henry, who I referenced earlier. Quote, a leading advocate of natural liberty in the 18th century was Patrick Henry, a descendant of British borderers and also a product of the American backcountry. Throughout his political career, Patrick Henry consistently defended the principles of minimal government, light taxes, and the right of armed resistance to authority in all cases which infringed liberty. In the first great issue that brought him to notice, the court case called the Parsons cause, Patrick Henry amazed his audience in the backcountry courthouse of Hanover County, Virginia, by arguing that the king, in disallowing an obscure act of 1758, had degenerated into a tyrant and forfeited all rights to his subjects' obedience. The Tidewater gentry were astounded by this argument. An eyewitness on that occasion remembered that amongst some gentlemen in the crowd behind me was a confused murmur of treason, treason. But the backcountry jury was highly pleased with these doctrines. End quote.
Indeed, you see this still to today in the differential way that various states treat jury nullification. Jury nullification is this idea of Patrick Henry's that an illegitimate law ought not be enforced, and the remedy is for the jury to acquit when the jury believes the law to be illegitimate. in West Virginia, which is, of course, in the backcountry and populated by backcountry people, this principle of jury nullification is actually read to the jury as part of the jury instructions. They are instructed that they may nullify the laws if they feel them to be unjust. Whereas if you tried that in Illinois, you would be disbarred. So different states treat it very differently. Some ignore it, some encourage it, and some absolutely forbid it.
And it's also worth pointing out as well, a lot of people associate the cause of liberty with the Enlightenment, but here we have an ancient culture preaching what most people get taught is Enlightenment political theory in their classes. I think we're about to get to an excerpt that goes further in depth, though. But once again, if there's one thing to take away from this, well, two things actually: don't disparage your heritage. But second, specifically to this point, is don't cede liberty to these very strange modern ideologies. It's an ancient thing that especially the English people in all of their different ways held to quite fiercely.
Held to and bled for.
Yes. The excerpt I want to get to next is pretty quick and really just a summary of everything we just talked about. It's on page 782. Quote, when backcountry men moved west in search of that condition of natural freedom, which Daniel Boone called elbow room, they were repeating the thought of George Harrison, a North Briton who declared in the borderlands during the 17th century that every man at nature's table has a right to elbow room. The southern frontier provided space for the realization of this ideal, but it did not create it. So again, this concept of elbow room, basically everyone has the right to a little bit of space to live their life as they best see it fit. This idea, as this quote says, came from a Northern Briton, not an American. This is a very old, ancient idea. All of these modern ideologies which seek to deprive us of our birthright. We discussed the concept last stream in regard to the Cavaliers, that the English people have this birthright to liberty. That also that's part of our American heritage. The American people have a natural birthright as Americans to a type of liberty we might describe as elbow room. I think that's a really good way of putting it. I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to add on the backcountry people before we get on to the same topic of liberty and power, etc., on the Puritans.
There is one. It's an excerpt from page 781, if that needs to be put on the screen, but I think I can summarize it very quickly here. The backcountry or the border idea of liberty was very much native to that culture. So if you go through Patrick Henry and his works, as Thomas Jefferson remarked, he's not some abstract ivory tower theorist hypothesizing like Locke and Hobbes about the state of nature and what this perfect conception of liberty is and whatnot else. Patrick Henry is very much just trying to verbalize the conception of liberty the backcountry has had for centuries at this point, the borders had rather. So the only thing that I would like to mention here specifically is that this is not sort of an abstracted theory that is now being applied to people. This developed by the interactions of the various clans of the borderers into what a lot of especially educators today confuse for Enlightenment political theory. This is not necessarily the case.
I should doubt that Patrick Henry even read Locke.
I can't believe it. How could he be a classical liberal without reading Locke?
Yeah, that little in joke is never going to get old. Anyway, let's move on to the Puritans. Getting back to those lovely people. Not being sarcastic, by the way. We just haven't seen them in a little while. So let's see, which page is this? It's on I think it's 199, probably in the notes. Let me just check really quick.
199 is Puritan unanimity.
199, 200.
There we go. Yeah,
it's Massachusetts Freedom Ways, the Puritan idea of ordered liberty. So let me just quote this. Quote, "The public life of New England was also shaped by an idea of liberty which was peculiar to the Puritan colonies. To understand its nature, one might begin with the word itself. From the generation of John Winthrop to that of Samuel Adams, the noun liberty was used throughout New England in at least four ways which ring strangely in a modern ear. First, liberty often described something which belonged not to an individual but to an entire community. For 2 centuries, the founders and leaders of Massachusetts wrote of the liberty of New England, or the liberty of Boston, or the liberty of the town. This usage continued from the Great Migration to the War of Independence and even beyond. Samuel Adams, for example, wrote more often about the liberty of America than about the liberty of individual Americans. So, yeah, I think you had some screenshots for the same page, but so I take it you have some things you'd like to add here.
Well, yes, but I have a feeling Mr. Quinn will be able to articulate this way better than I could. But this is you can very much see in New England, this is where we get the American emphasis on decentralization. Things should be handled at the local level, and it's not just a utilitarian or pragmatic thing. It's something that's given to the community itself. It's sort of an ethical concern, a moral failing perhaps in New England if one's community was not in many ways self-sufficient.
Indeed, it's interesting that when the Puritans spoke of liberty and liberties, when they were speaking of communities, a community had liberty, but individuals had liberties. And these liberties were enumerated, they were specific, and they were not uniform across people. Different people had different liberties, but the general liberty inhered in their community, not in the individual.
And it should also be mentioned here as well that this is not something that the Puritans just decided to endeavor upon in the New World ex nihilo. This is a East Anglian tradition, and it's also where we get another facet of American life, which is constitutionalism. Because in East Anglia, the communities were governed very much locally and according to community constitutions, basically. Each one very different, tailored to its local peoples. And they expected these constitutions to be followed quite strictly.
Indeed, and they had genealogies for these constitutions in the New World, various small Massachusetts towns. The specific example from the book escapes me, but they would have these written constitutions that would cite, all the way back to the Magna Carta and Runnymede as the source of their liberty.
Yes, and continuing on this same topic in regard to the Puritans, I'll continue to the next page, page 200, where we can read, quote, "This idea of collective liberty, or public liberty, as it was sometimes called, was thought to be consistent with close restraints upon individuals. In Massachusetts, these individual restrictions were numerous and often very confining. During the first generation, nobody could live in the colony without approval of the general court. Settlers, even of the highest rank, were sent prisoners to England for expressing diverse dangerous opinions, or merely because the court judged them to be persons unmeet to inhabit here. Others were not allowed to move within the colony except by special permission of the general court. For a time, the inhabitants of Dedham, Sudbury, and Concord were forbidden to move out of their towns because the general court believed that those frontier settlements were dangerously underpopulated. This idea of collective liberty was also expressed in many bizarre obligations which New England towns collectively imposed upon their members. Eastham's town meeting, for example, ordered that no single man could marry until he had killed 6 blackbirds or 3 crows. Every town book contained many such rules. The general court also passed sweeping statutes which allowed the magistrates to suppress almost any act by any means. One such law, for example, threatened that if any man shall exceed the bounds of moderation, we shall punish him severely. The definition of exceeding the bounds of moderation was left to the magistrate. New Englanders willingly accepted individual restraints, but insisted that they should be consistent with written laws, which they called the fundamentals of the Commonwealth. Further, they demanded that the liberty to impose these restraints upon themselves in their own way. This was what they meant by the public liberty of New England. Interference by outsiders met fierce and implacable resistance. End quote. So, this idea, everything I just read actually reminds me of one of the upcoming books that we have, Creating the Commonwealth, and the the New Englanders, the Puritans, organized their society a very deliberate way, and there were a great many restrictions on the individual liberties of peoples. But all of this served the interest of the colony in that they created a very middling peoples in terms of, I mean, a middle class type of peoples where as we I believe we discussed last time, they deliberately excluded the aristocracy and the sort of vagrants from England, and they would send people back if they didn't fit in. They ensured that their colony basically only included people who could really make it in the new world on their own and were truly fit to live there. And all of these restrictions on individual liberty really served that end. It served the greater community, which then in turn served the interest of all the individuals.
It might be worth mentioning here as well. If I remember correctly, I think the sort of state level or community level, basically for a lot of New England states, these sort of state level prohibitions on vagrants and whatnot else entering the colonies, this idea being sort of a infringement on the community to be forced to let them in, and also just not what they were trying to do. These laws, if I remember correctly, persisted well into the mid 19th century because I think there were several deportations from New England of immigrants that were considered to be vagrants and other such underclass types from the perspective of the Puritans or the New Englanders by that time. So this persisted for quite a long time in that culture.
Yes, and all right. So now I want to move on to their power ways, which relates to their concept of the town. Unless there's anything else you want to add here, this would be page 196.
The only thing I could think of adding, something that's very important, especially for American history and heritage, is that the Puritans also have the idea of freedom from various different sort of natural anxieties, which, if that sounds familiar to people, it's because this exact sentiment, verbatim in some cases from a lot of Puritan writers, was invoked by FDR during the New Deal. So this is where you can get that more overbearing form of liberty, especially for as perceived by the other folkways in the United States.
So even the dreaded FDR is actually consistent with our American heritage. All right, so quoting from the book again, The Politics of Town Meeting Government. Quote, within a few years of settlement, a unique system of government by town meetings and selectmen took form in Massachusetts. Many historians believe that these institutions were invented in the New World. Leading dictionaries identify the words town meeting and selectmen as Americanisms. Nothing could be further from the case. New England town meetings were transplanted from East Anglia, where they had existed for many centuries before the Great Migration. In the Suffolk County Record Office at Ipswich, for example, one may find a musty leather-bound folio volume of great antiquity which contains the records of the parish of Framlingham, after which the Massachusetts town of Framingham, they dropped the L, took its name. On its cover, this volume bears a title which is written in an old hand, Town Book. In many East Anglian communities, the words town and parish were used interchangeable. In the Great Book of Framlingham, the expressions general parish meeting and general town meeting were synonyms. These East Anglian towns governed themselves through officers sometimes called selectmen. Some East Anglian selectmen were elected by all the people called townsmen. Others were self-perpetuating oligarchies. Always, selectmen were men of substance, prosperous yeomen and artisans for the most part. They were also men with gray heads, chosen for their maturity, wisdom, and experience in local government. In some East Anglian communities, selectmen were called ancients. The selectmen disposed of routine business, but in many parishes of East Anglia, larger questions were dealt with by assemblies explicitly called town meetings, which brought together the principal inhabitants of the community. These East Anglian town meetings were diverse in their structure. No two of them were quite the same, but they commonly allowed a large number of townsmen to participate in local government. End quote. So yeah, there we come to understand the sort of central organizing feature of the Massachusetts colony, which is the town. So there was not the Puritans placed a great emphasis on the autonomy and, as we described, the liberty of the town as the social organizing unit. The towns were kept at particular sizes, organized particular ways by the larger body of power above the individual towns, but each town, as we referenced earlier, had its very own unique systems of rules and whatever regulations that the town needed to place upon its people in order to function within the Puritan way of life.
Yeah, this contrasts with, say, the Cavalier idea of the great estates, the plantations, and the patriarchal agrarian method of governing, or the clan-based method of the backcountry people. This is a different conception of political order.
Right, and hopefully people in our organization might see a few parallels with what we do. It's a very old system, very English, and I tend to think it works quite well, especially when you have people that are very energetic, opinionated, good-natured, but also disagreeable. Is that something that we see very often in New England? The reason why there are so many small and strange-shaped localities on the map is just because if people didn't get along, they left, formed their own town, and that was how they operated. And the same thing happened until they stretched to the Hudson. So perhaps people can see a little bit parallels there.
We are a magnificent herd of cats.
All right, and now trying to close out this section on the Puritans before we get to the Cavaliers. Let's look at the section on their orderways on page 189. Massachusetts orderways, the Puritan idea of order as unity. Quote, yet another component of this culture was its system of social order. In that regard, New England was characterized by a curious paradox. This was always the most orderly region in British America, but it was also very violent in its ordering acts. This typically Puritan paradox of private order and public violence was especially striking in the 17th and 18th centuries. For many generations, individual order coexisted with an institutional savagery that appeared in the burning of rebellious servants, the maiming of political dissenters, the hanging of Quakers, the execution of witches, and the crushing to death with heavy stones of an old man who refused to plead before the court. These two tendencies of individual order and institutional violence were closely linked. Among the Puritan founders of Massachusetts, order was an obsession. The intensity of their concern and its distance from our own time appeared in a startling argument by Puritan minister John Norton, who had insisted that it was better an innocent and good man should suffer than order, for that preserves the whole. The prevailing idea of order in Puritan Massachusetts was very different from our own conceptions. It did not primarily mean a state of peace and serenity, as Webster's dictionary defines it, but rather a condition where everything was put in its proper place and held there by force if necessary. Order for the Puritans meant a condition of organic unity, the order that preserves the whole, in John Norton's definition, of oneness of the spirit that did not readily admit internal differences. The same idea often appeared in Puritan writings. John Winthrop spoke of order as the preservation of good and the whole. The Puritan divine Solomon Stoddard explained that a church is not a confused body of people, but they that are brought into order, and each must observe his proper station. It is compared to a natural body, wherein there are diverse organs appointed to their, continuing to page 190. Actually, this skips ahead a little bit, but I'll continue on page 190. This idea of order as an organic unity was deeply embedded in the cosmology of English Calvinism, but the ordering institutions of New England were drawn from a different source, mainly those that had existed in the towns of East Anglia. The builders of the Bay Colony chose very selectively from these English precedents. In the first generation, for example, they decided not to introduce the office of sheriff. That hated symbol of royal prerogative and aristocratic power were not welcome in New England. Neither, at first, did they have any use for the peacekeeping officers of the Anglican Church, such as beadles and other parish policemen, who were chosen by vestry and clergy to collect tithes and keep order. Through the first half of the 17th century, the Bay colonists did without these unpopular officials. Puritan Massachusetts turned instead to the most communitarian of English peacekeepers, the village constable. This was an ancient office, derived from the borsholders, borough heads, and reeves who were elected by English township or tithing, rather than being appointed by higher authority. In New England, the constable was an officer of the town, chosen by his neighbors. His duty was to serve processes, execute warrants, deliver writs, make arrests, and summon town meetings. He could also be called upon to collect taxes, organize elections, look after lost goods, recover stray animals, keep a record of newcomers to the town, and arrest such strange persons as do walk abroad in the night, and sleep in the day, or which do haunt any house, where is suspicion of body. He was also required to visit and inspect all the households in the town at least once every 3 months, and each year to read all the laws pertaining to the Sabbath. When serious trouble threatened, the constable was not expected to deal with it himself, but to summon all the men of the town, who were required by law to support him. In New England, the community itself was the ultimate peacekeeper. And that ends the quote. So that was a bit long, but that basically puts forward the whole concept of order within the Puritan society. I have some things I could add. Either of you gentlemen want to respond to anything in that text, though?
I have nothing in particular. This is just it's a fine excerpt of Puritan localism and strict order keeping, which
Yeah, it's pretty
I find to be
self-explanatory.
yeah.
One thing I would just point out is on page 189 there was this reference to sort of organic unity, which is something people will attribute to like Julius Avila or something, but we have strong American and English traditions of this idea of American of organic society, organic unity, as is demonstrated very well here in the Puritans. So you really don't need to look to these foreigners for these concepts, which can be found directly within your own heritage. Not sure if I had passed it up or if we had mentioned it on the first stream, but the Puritans also faced this sort of high-low versus middle phenomena in England, where the sheriff would collect taxes from them for the aristocrats, and they were also required to make tithes to the church in order to support the poor. So this is one of the reasons that the Puritans excluded both of these elements of society from their colony, because part of their motivation was actually escaping this sort of high-low versus middle tyranny that they were subjected to in East Anglia, particularly through the office of the sheriff.
And if I could build on your point as well, I don't mean to shill myself, but I made exactly the same point with Aaron McIntyre earlier. I guess it would be last week when we were going over one of John C. Calhoun's very underappreciated books. Because this is if you go back and actually read through your American and English heritage, which is everywhere in this country, you find that you'll find a lot of the concepts that the online right recently has pulled out of various different continental European and other sort of strange traditions, which you don't really find over here. You find a lot of the same concepts. They're all very politically useful, but something that you get reading these people instead of the continental Europeans or some of the strange, more occultic groups of thought is this sort of love of liberty as an ancient right of ours. This is something that's often seen as bad by other cultures. And perhaps they have their reasons, but that's a foreign concept to us. Liberty is not something to be pitted against order. The two go together, and depending on which of the folkways, one may precede the other, but they all have to go together, liberty and order. Sorry, this is not something that you'll find in many other folkways and societies across Europe or the world.
Yes, in our own tradition, the two are self-buttressing and inseparable. The roof collapses without either of them.
All right, and now we're going to finally get back to our friends, the Virginia Cavaliers, and discuss some of these topics within the context of that society. So we've got page 412. and this is going to discuss briefly the concept of liberty within Virginia, as seen through the eyes of the Cavaliers. Quote, "It never occurred to most Virginia gentlemen that liberty belonged to everyone. It was thought to be the special birthright of free-born Englishmen, a property which set this happy breed apart from other mortals, and gave them a right to rule less fortunate people in the world. Even within their own society, hegemonic liberty was a hierarchical idea. One's status in Virginia was defined by the liberties that one possessed. Men of high estate were thought to have more liberties than others of lesser rank. Servants possessed few liberties, and slaves none at all. This libertarian idea had nothing to do with equality. Many years later, John Randolph of Roanoke summarized his ancestral creed in a sentence. 'I am an aristocrat,' he declared. 'I love liberty, I hate equality.' In Virginia, this idea of hegemonic liberty was thought to be entirely consistent with the institution of race slavery. A planter demanded for himself the liberty to take away the liberties of others, a right of laisser servir, freedom to enslave. The growth of race slavery in turn deepened the cultural significance of hegemonic liberty, for an Englishman's rights became his rank and set him apart from others less fortunate than himself. The world thus became a hierarchy in which people were ranked according to many degrees of unfreedom, and they received their rank by the operation of fortune, which played a large part in the thinking of the Virginians. At the same time, hegemony over others allowed them to enlarge the sphere of their own personal liberty and create the conditions within which their special sort of libertarian consciousness flourished. To a modern mind, hegemonic liberty is an idea at war with itself. We think of it as a contradiction in terms. This is because we no longer understand human relationships in hierarchical terms and can no longer accept the proposition that a person's status in the world is determined and even justified by his fortune." End quote. I wanted to include that last bit there just because, you know, one of the interesting things in you read these books is like there's this obsession with like pointing out the contradictions. It's like the author is sort of just declaring there's like an obvious. I mean, he's not doing so personally. He's using the royal we, but he sort of declares that there's a contradiction in this idea of liberty, and this relates in some sense to, you know, some of our modern political quandaries. It's not really the point of these streams, but I will mention that, you know, the idea of who is an American, and which is, you know, something we're actually covering here in this book. Who belongs in the country? Americans belong in the country, and people who aren't Americans don't belong here and should be made to leave. And there's no real contradiction in saying that this place is for us and not other people. But modern peoples only seem to be able to think in these terms of equality, and that you have to sort of apply all rules equally to everyone on the planet, whereas there's no contradiction there. There's no inconsistency. That is, the rule is that America is for Americans and no one else, and there is no contradiction built into that. And I would like to strongly push back against the idea that there even is a contradiction to resolve there, because there isn't one.
Correct. The contradiction only arises if you accept the premise that of total equality between peoples, that different peoples don't have different life ways and different liberties arising therefrom.
And something else to keep in mind as well, the sentiment that John Randolph is echoing: I am an aristocrat, number one. Number two, I love liberty. And then finally, I hate equality. All three of those statements is a glorious inheritance that we received through this folkway from the medieval era in Europe. It starts to disappear soon afterwards, in part due to radical movements, but also even due to sort of the enlightened absolutism and the sort of destruction of the aristocracy in favor of the bureaucracy and the monarch's court.
Indeed,
so this is yeah, go on.
Now we saw this great flattening in the absolutist courts of Europe, where you had the king and you had the peasantry, and all the intermediary ranks of society were marginalized and eventually liquidated. And that is, of course, had the effect of opening the bottom rung of society to levels of tyranny which were impossible in a more stratified society.
Exactly. So this is something that I've talked about for a long time now, but you can find a lot of medieval traditions and ideas in America that did not survive in Europe. They just came over here and kept going sort of in a natural order of its own.
Indeed, and that the Puritan example is an excellent illustration of that. These community liberties retained, in some sense, the old medieval structure of a stratified society with different levels of interaction and levels of power, which tended to diffuse authority and prevent tyranny.
All right, and with that brief discussion of the Cavaliers, we're going to loop all the way back around to the Quakers again and discuss some of these ideas, particularly regarding order and liberty.
Before we do
If
that,
there's anything to add, go ahead. We're still making good time, so we can squeeze in something.
yeah, I'll be very brief here. So we've talked about the really good elements of New England and the South and their political ideologies. But it's very easy to see if you combine the very top-down nature of Southern society with the New England conception of liberty, including its freedom from want. It's very easy to see the sort of New Deal coalition arise between the Southern Democrats and the more Northern New Liberals would be, I think, a proper term for them. You can see that, yeah, the New Deal coalition is very American. It just, as we discussed in the first stream, not everything that these people did was perfectly good or perfectly bad. Perhaps we can be cognizant of these things going forward.
Yes, the marriage of the Southern centralization and top down within New England, de-emphasis of individual rights as compared to the other American folkways, certainly bore poisonous fruit in the New Deal and prior to the New Deal.
Alrighty, and now getting back to the Quakers, page 578, we're just going to contextualize the Quaker township briefly, so we have a conception of their society in contrast with the Puritans, especially. Quote, Penn's ideal townships, this is William Penn, were different in scale from New England towns, which tended to be at least 6 miles on a side and 20,000 acres in area, sometimes much larger. The townships of Pennsylvania were originally intended to cover only about 5,000 acres and to include only about 50 people. They were not self-governing. The vision of the founder was a quiet, open countryside dotted with small clusters of independent farms. By 1685, more than 50 of these little townships had actually been planted in Pennsylvania. So with that in mind, we will move on to page 585, which actually both myself and Ryan had identified as something to talk about. So I will just read the quote here. Page 585, quote, As always, the leading exponent was William Penn himself. He defined order as a system which enjoins men to be just, honest, virtuous, do no wrong, to kill, rob, deceive, prejudice none, but to do as one would be done unto. The same idea was written into the laws of West Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, which made their officers responsible for maintaining good order, by which was meant a condition of social peace in which each individual was forbidden to intrude upon the quiet of another person. This was a revolutionary idea in its own time, a conception of order in which everyone did not have to believe the same creed or to fit into a single hierarchy. Here was an open idea of order, grounded in the golden rule and the doctrine of the light within. To Anglicans, this Quaker idea of order appeared to be dangerously permissive. To Puritans, it seemed a contradiction in terms, but an idea of order as mutual forbearance to find its own obligations, which the Quakers enforced very strictly in their own colonies. Their conduct of this experiment was more tough-minded than either of their admirers or their critics have believed.
Indeed, as we talk
so
about,
I'll go ahead and pass that to you.
The winnowing of American virtue, what you can see here is this tough-minded covenant of not intruding upon each other's quiet would eventually lose its tough-mindedness and descend into I just want to grill.
Right, and it's There's something else to be said here, something that's been lost in time, and as the Quaker Society either was co-opted or degenerated. The differences don't really matter for this stream. I'm sure we'll touch on it sometime in the future. Is they believed that they were going to have like a strict hierarchical order. It would just be arranged by merit. We don't really need to bring up the excerpts for this, but this is something to keep in mind. Every single time that it sounds like they're going to drift into egalitarianism fully, they had some other idea that they held in the balance that kept their society from breaking down, basically. So this idea of applying the golden rule to absolutely everyone, it was buttressed not only by their very devout religious beliefs, but also by this idea that only the most pious and virtuous would rise to the top. It's not perfectly Aristotelian, but you can kind of see elements of it in there. And William Penn was a very well-read man. That's all I really had on this subject.
Cool. And moving on to page, I think 586. Yes, we'll discuss briefly again some of the ways in which they kept order on page 586. Quote, and this is discussing their peacekeepers or peacemakers. These justices were assisted by another set of public officers who were unique to Quaker colonies. They were called peacemakers. Disputes of a non-criminal nature were referred to them for arbitration under the direction of the court. Disputes between Quakers themselves were arbitrated in a different way under the direction of their meetings. Members of the Society of Friends were generally forbidden to go to law against one another. If they insisted upon doing so, they were sometimes punished by expulsion from meeting. This combination of order keepers, sheriffs, justices, and peacemakers, and arbitrators was unique to the Delaware Valley. So, yes, they had a very particular and well-defined set of persons who kept the peace between the members of the society. You were expected to utilize the peacemakers in particular for private arbitration purposes rather than going to the courts. Actually, I wanted to jump on something you had just said there, Ryan, as well, regarding the golden rule. Like it's mentioned in the book somewhere that the backcountry peoples, a lot of them actually came through the ports in Pennsylvania. This made the Quakers very unhappy, and they exported them to the backcountry Appalachians in Pennsylvania. So their society, their order ways, although they afforded quite a few liberties to their people, they were all expected to be Quakers. They did not accept non-Quakers into their society, which is how this thing worked. Maybe draw your own conclusions from that, relating to our modern circumstances.
Well, there's something very interesting there, because a lot of people have interpreted that, and I don't personally have an opinion either way here. A lot of people have interpreted this as just a sort of like a Quaker workaround from their pacifism. They couldn't defend themselves from natives, so they just took the most violent people they could find in the ports and threw them to the frontier as a practical measure. That could very well be the case. There's evidence suggesting it is, but as we were just elaborating upon, they also had a reason for doing so that wasn't just this very cold political calculation. So you can, like most things in this, if there is something that we find to be contradictory, hypocritical, or whatever else, it could definitely be that, but there's also usually a pretty convincing explanation from their beliefs as to why things were this way.
All right, and continuing on their order ways, page 587. Let's see here. Yeah, so this is on the types of crime that were common and which were not. Quote, if crimes against public morality were comparatively uncommon in Pennsylvania, a great many people were punished for violating the private rights of others. The court docket of Chester County was crowded with cases of trespass, trover, and case in which these old forms of common law pleading were turned to due purpose by a pluralistic culture. In the Delaware Valley, crimes against property and crimes against persons tended to be roughly equal in their incidence, unlike New England, where property crime predominated, and the southern colonies, where personal crimes were more common. So this sort of gives you an idea of what sorts of things they and the other societies were interested in prosecuting. Whereas the Puritans might be more interested in public morality, the violation of private rights is something the Quakers were particularly interested in, preventing the violation of and prosecuting.
You were relatively safe to have a malshapen pig in Quaker colonies.
Very correct.
Yeah, indeed. Continuing on, and this part is actually pretty interesting. 589. Quote, further, the Quakers adopted penal practices which were designed not to punish the offender but to rehabilitate him. The object was not to isolate the criminal from society, but to restore him as rapidly as possible. In the 1690s, prisoners of Philadelphia's House of Correction were allowed to leave their cells during hot weather. The courts of Pennsylvania and West Jersey also used peace bonds in a special way, issuing them in lieu of an indictment as an alternative to a criminal proceeding. End quote. So that's pretty interesting, because we would normally consider this idea of rehabilitative justice as a very modern practice that has no basis in reality. You can argue over whether or not this is a good idea. I would imagine that, given the uniformity of the Quaker society, it's probably a lot safer to attempt rehabilitative justice amongst fellow Quakers rather than just random people who come into your society unchecked. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah, I mean, the Quakers led the way in prison reform and the development of the modern prison system. The panopticon, which we refer to today, originally referred to a real physical building, which was built by the Quakers so that you could stand at one point and look into every cell and see that every prisoner was doing rehabilitative work on himself to ensure that he would leave the prison as a fully functioning member of society.
It's also worth noting as well, since they were prison reformers, meaning that they were bringing in this more supposedly rehabilitative, indefinitely non-capital method of punishment, or at least penalty or recourse, however you want to describe it. This ties into with why the penalties for their laws were sometimes so extreme. Because something we didn't explicitly mention on this stream, but that I will just briefly mention, is that their penalty for things like sodomy and bestiality was, in some cases, you either were arrested, castrated, sometimes you were branded on the forehead. All these laws, which were abolished by the crown, once again for being too unreasonable. So this is something to keep in mind. They weren't squishy. They didn't like the death penalty. They were ostensibly pacifist. That doesn't mean that they were overly permissive, and definitely out of all the Folkways we've been discussing, they had the most painful and brutal legal punishments on the books out of all the four.
Sure, partly because in the other three they would just kill you, so the Quakers had to get a bit more creative.
Right, but it's I don't know. I would say there's probably a more painful difference between the hanging and being branded on the forehead. I don't know. Perhaps that's a personal judgment, but once again, these people weren't squishy.
No, these were not hippies.
All right. Well, it's about time to start wrapping up the stream, because we have gone quite long again, but we've basically gone for almost the exact amount of time we went for the first one. So I think we did a pretty good job redoing this and making it a good fix for our technical flub last week. Now, we can bring up any last minute things you guys want to throw in. There is one self-serving thing I want to bring up once again, which I did last time, but on page 258, this is regarding the speechways of the Virginians. So we can read here, quote, consonants were also softened and prolonged, as in sebum for seven, chimbly for chimney, vomit for vermin, holt for hold, mo for more, flow for four, dough for door, fo for for, dis for this, dat for that, dare for there, and most importantly, ax for ask. So anyone yelling at you for saying that ax is not proper English, well, you're wrong, because it says here in this book that it's totally fine to say ax instead of ask.
I must
There's
commend
actually
you,
another funny
Charlie.
bit.
On your second attempt to read that, you actually did manage to distinguish the different pronunciations audibly. So well done.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then on a more meta point, we've talked about this before, but if you as an American have been going to more foreign philosophies and come away hating such things as liberty, decentralization, and self-determination and whatnot else, you're being convinced to hate your heritage. So this is if you take nothing else away from these streams, just know that American political traditions, culture, and whatnot else is very old. It comes from England, and it was imported over here by the people that settled and pioneered the land.
Am I unmuted right now? Okay.
Yes, we hear you.
There's one other. The browser was freezing a little bit. There's one other thing I'll throw in just for fun. I didn't actually bring this one up last time, but I have this famous phrase coined from another set of streams. It goes, "I do be like that," or "It do be like that." Sorry, and this is sort of emphasizing a particular way of speaking. So, quote, where a northerner said, "I am, you are, she isn't, it doesn't, and I haven't," a Virginia, even of high rank, preferred to say, "I be, you be, she ain't, it don't, and I hain't." That's pretty interesting. Yeah. So it do be like that.
Like
Language do be like that. So yeah, with that, we've only got 2 super chats to thank our viewers for. I believe they're both just donations thanking us for the stream. Let's see, I've got one of them in front of me for $9.99. Yes, from Kyle Linskog. I'm enjoying this. I'm enjoying the stream, but have to run. Thanks, gentlemen. And,
Thank you, Kyle.
I actually lost the first super chat. It was for $5. I'm not sure if the producer had saved it. Yeah, there it is. Let me check it real quick. So yeah, of course, from Bolero393, $5. There's a great bundling scene in the painstakingly historically accurate film The Patriot with Mel Gibson. I actually wanted to rewatch the Patriot the other day, but we had to watch the Team America World Police movie for our July 4th stream. Do I have time to watch tonight? Maybe I'll see if I have the DVD handy and actually just watch that. So I don't remember that. I will be sure to look out for that bundling scene in The Patriot next time I watch it.
No degeneracy, Charlie.
And who was it who described bundling? Anyone want to just refresh us? What is bundling?
Yeah, bundling is where the parents of two young lovers would take the woman, bind her legs together, cover her in thick garments, throw her in the bed, and then the man and she would spend the night together to work out whether they loved each other enough to get married.
And if I recall, this was an element of the Puritan sex ways.
Yeah, that was a Puritan courting ritual. Because the Puritans had this idea that you did have to marry for love. You couldn't marry unless you loved each other. And so their whole courting practices were built around maintaining propriety whilst also allowing the young couple enough semi-unsupervised time to actually figure out if they loved each other or not.
All right. Well, with that, that's all the super chats. So thank you for joining me again. We have a super sticker. Wow. Let me check out the super sticker. It's from Dawn Browning, of course, for $10. Super sticker. It appears to be some sort of fuzzy mammal, possibly a fox, rolling on the ground laughing. So probably that's laughing at my speech references, I would imagine, because they were very funny.
You do a great news broadcaster impression.
So with that, let's re-announce the next books we're looking at. We're actually maintaining our original order now, because I've had an extra week to correct buying the wrong copy of the American language. So now I have the actual, not the supplement, but the American language, I think 4th edition by H.L. Mencken, here in my hands. We will be discussing that 1 week from today. So if you want to pick up the American language by H.L. Mencken, feel free. And then the week after that, this is a shorter one. Maybe you can read it if you don't have time to read both. Creating the Commonwealth will be 2 weeks from now. This is by Stephen Innes. Creating the Commonwealth on the Economic Culture of Puritan New England. So we'll be having a sort of deeper discussion on the economic structure of the Puritan society. All right, that's all we have today. Thanks, everyone.